Okay, let's get this underway. Welcome, everyone. This session is Mobilizing Community Advocacy and Action as part of our campaigns and advocacy stream. We're so excited that so many people are in the room today. I think we have a really good session ahead of us. We're going to have 3 different presenters for today's presentation. So we have Diana, who will speak first, and then Yutaka, and then Art will finish it off. I do want to acknowledge, just as a moderator, that the National Conference on Ending Homelessness is taking place on Indigenous lands, and the Kanahaga is recognized as the custodians of the land and waters on which we gather today. In Jojagwe, Montreal is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations, and we're thankful to be here today for our conference. So if you would, all the presentations will be in English, so if you would like interpretation, we have interpreters at the back. You can grab headsets from where they're available. If you would like interpretation back into French, but without anything else, I think we'll get started. So I'll put Diana's presentation up, and we'll do all the 3 presentations back to back, and then a Q&A at the end. Okay, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Maggie. My name is Diana Chan McNally. I'm based in Toronto. A lot of people ask me, what do you do? It's a good question. I consider myself a fixer more than an organizer, but I'm often working with lots of different organizations around the issue of homelessness, specifically in Toronto and in Ontario. So I'll try to kind of give tips of what I've learned as someone who's fixing/organizing, and also kind of give you an example of what the kind of work that I've been doing. One thing I want to mention is that this is not something I've been doing very long, and I have an absolutely just egregious face in this photo, but this is the first time I ever deputed, ever did anything sort of in the political and advocacy arena, and that was only in 2019. So this is not something that I've been doing for a very long time. I was kind of pushed into it, and it's also something that I was really afraid of doing. And what you can't tell from my snotty face in this photo is that I was trembling the entire time while talking to my local council. So just to say that when we do this work, don't be afraid of it. I know, because I was afraid of it, was very nervous to be doing this work, but don't be afraid of advocacy. And I think a lot of times this word is considered a dirty word. It's something that we're doing off the sides of our desks or doing in the background and not doing as actually part of our paid work. Most of the time it's not paid work, but it's something that I think we have to do in order to actually push the envelope in terms of where we are in policy and programs and resources around homelessness. So I was a frontline worker. 11 years I was a frontline worker, including as a crisis worker. And what I found is that in that work, I was always applying bandages to an open wound that just kept on bleeding. If there isn't the policy change that we need, if we don't have the resources available to end homelessness, then all we're doing on the front line is continually applying that Band-Aid, and it is debilitating. I find it really difficult to do that work, and when I think about burnout, that's what burnout to me is to continually be doing work without actually ending or making significant change in the problem. And what I also found is that advocacy work is very much complementary to doing frontline work. In fact, that work should be rooted in the frontline because that's where people are seeing the real issues at hand. It was often a difficult dance for me as someone who was working frontline, didn't have much power in my organization, but it also gave me credibility. Because I could talk about exactly what I was seeing on the ground and communicate that to politicians in a way that actually would move them. I do want to say that, none of us, we don't have limitless capacity. I've heard a lot over the past 2 days about people feeling burnt out, about compassion fatigue and all of this. We don't have infinite money. We don't have infinite ability to work. We don't have infinite resources, and our emotional well-being is often compromised by the work that we're doing because of those gaps in the social safety net. So for me, the way that I keep doing this work is to be an advocate. That gives me agency, and it makes me feel as though I have power to change the conditions we are existing in rather than merely serving poverty and homelessness. Now, I do want to acknowledge that I'm just a guy. I'm not working at the organizational level. I'm a guy who mostly works out of their apartment. I got 2 cats, I have a laptop, and I'm always organizing with those resources, and that's essentially it. The cats help, they provide emotional support. For me, that's important. But at the organizational level, we all remember when Stephen Harper was Prime Minister that there was a real chill put on advocacy. There was a threat against organizations advocating. And I still think there's this pervasive idea that if we are advocating as organizations, we are going to put our funding at risk. And so I always question that and want to push back, because what are our resources right now? Is our funding enough that it requires silence? I think in a lot of cases, that's not true. And I think we do have a duty as organizations, and I can say this again as someone on the front line, I want our EDs, I want our boards to be pushing back on our behalf to, again, make this work sustainable by actually changing the conditions of homelessness and poverty. So this is all to say, don't fear advocacy, embrace it, because if we don't push back our work, at some point, we can no longer sustain it. It will actually become unviable. The other thing I want to say is be real. So when we're talking about this work, there's a lot of kind of high-level language that gets used that is not necessarily understood by politicians or the public more broadly. And the way that I make this work real for people is by bringing that frontline experience into my advocate work. So I will say balancing frontline work with advocacy, again, super hard. At a certain point, there was only one agency that was like, okay, we'll let you do this because they didn't have any government funding. That was a boon to me because it meant that they weren't worried about risking anything. So I could be kind of off the hook, which was an ideal situation for me. But that's not going to be the situation for most people, and I want to recognize that. There is a level of danger and risk associated with advocacy work. Harassment, I get it all the time. I get death threats. I get all kinds of stuff from people. Loss of job prospects. People think you're a liability as opposed to an asset. Arrest. Who hasn't been arrested? I've been arrested. If you haven't been arrested, I don't know if I trust you. That's okay. I do think we need to break down those barriers between the front line, between management, and between activists on the ground. I think we compartmentalize that work in ways that actually don't benefit the outcomes that we actually want, which again is to materially change the conditions of homelessness. We often are actually at odds with each other, fighting with each other, as opposed to coming together strategically as a movement to push back, again, for the resources that we need to end homelessness. And as I mentioned before, frontline staff want to know that the people that they're working for are going to go to bat for them. It, again, is not possible to continually suck up everything that we see happening on the ground and feel like this is good, meaningful work when it doesn't feel like it's getting any better, and in fact is actively getting worse. So I want to challenge organizations, if you're in the room, anyone who's a manager, to actually create avenues for advocacy within your organizations. Make room for the front line to speak to what they see and to advocate for the people that we are intended to serve. Our duty is not to protect our funding. Sorry, it's not. It's to protect the people that we are actively serving. And I know that some people might just go, oh, I don't know about that. But if we are protecting our funding first and it's not actually supporting the people that we are there to serve, then what are we actually doing? Right? So there's a balance between these things. I do want to recognize that, but I do think that we have to push back and we have to tap into our front line in order to be able to do that in a good way. So consider advocacy committees, media training, speakers rosters, deputations, giving people avenues to take a little bit of time off of work and go to their city councils and delegate or depute, and working in coalition with advocacy groups and activist groups on the ground. Be smart. Here is where I think a lot of the problem is that we think at the very high level, just give people housing. All right, well, what are the steps to actually get there? We can have these really high-level goals that we're setting, but we actually need to have achievable goals in the interim. Our work, whether we like it or not, is incremental. We can't win it all in one go, so we have to continually push for a little bit more and a little bit more. And sometimes I recognize that's tiring because you want so much more than you're actually able to win. But ultimately, this is how we make change. It's exhausting. It's not that fun, but it's one win at a time. Other evidence of winning, besides those small kind of changes in public policy or resources, is when you start to notice that the public narrative on homelessness is changing. And I think during the pandemic, we saw a shift in how we talk about encampments. Maybe it's swinging the other way at the moment, and I want to recognize that as well. But for a while, most of the public, at least where I am in Toronto, were on side with understanding that people are in the park because they don't have anywhere else to go. we have a duty to provide housing for them. So when I started to hear that coming from the public, people I didn't know, people who didn't know me, I knew that we were making a tangible difference because the public finally understood what the difference is needed to actually, again, end encampments in our city. Now, how do you win your goals is also kind of the question here. Moral demands, they don't work. Be better, do the right thing. If I yelled that at you or you yelled that at me, I would probably just say some expletive at you, you might say some expletive at me, and that wouldn't actually push either of us to do what's needed. Interestingly, facts don't work either. Oftentimes the fiscal argument doesn't work either. Attacking someone's reputation doesn't work. That can backfire very, very quickly. And what I think it does is it shifts attention away from what you actually want to achieve and turns it into an interpersonal battle that doesn't achieve anything. So what I learned, and weirdly I worked at the Ontario legislature mostly to learn how government works. It was the worst decision in my life, but I learned a lot. Politicians are often agnostic about morality and they're agnostic about facts. You have to build political leverage against somebody. Politicians can be influenced if something is politically expedient for them, or it can be very detrimental to them. So you have to find ways to build that leverage. And that doesn't need to be nasty, but it's to say you have to have something that you can hold over them, some kind of power. So building that leverage is something that I've learned to do, and it's something that I learned while working in the Ontario legislature. Be strategic. You need an inside game and you need an outside game. And I think oftentimes these don't work well together and people are always about one or the other. Actually, I used to work for Butila Carpoche, who was the MPP, my MPP in Parkdale High Park in the Ontario legislature. That's me and her. But we're talking about ending homelessness. This is after I quit my job. She was very gracious and not hating me for doing that. Building an inside game is building relationships with politicians. And the way that I literally started doing this when I first started advocating was to send an email to everyone on my council and be like, hey, this is my name. I'm ready to work with you at any point. Always approach me about a conversation. I will work with anybody who will work with me. And that's true. It took a little bit of time for that to sink in, but now I have very good relationships with a number of councillors in the city of Toronto where I can directly approach them about things and we can kind of bypass a lot of the outside game of just lobbying people and yelling at them to do certain things by prioritizing that relationship. What I also do a lot of the time is actually write policy for them, which is really nerdy, but I have written policy for councillors and just emailed it to them and be like, what if you did this? And people have taken that verbatim and actually passed motions based on me just literally writing the policy on their behalf. And that seems like ballsy, I guess, but sometimes people are lazy and they want someone to do that work for them and they want the easy win. Okay, if that's what it takes to get something done, then that's exactly what I'm gonna do. But you do need that outside game as well. I think it's hard to balance the two, and I don't want to suggest that it's a very easy thing to do, but you'll often see me at rallies and you'll often see me criticizing governments more broadly, not personally, but broadly. But you do need both. And I think media work is also a really important part of any strategy to achieve the outcomes you want. I do a lot of media work. I do a lot of public talking. I used to be a teacher, so I'm maybe not that bad at public speaking. But how you communicate your message is as important as the message itself. So being clear, being succinct, and I think really importantly, not that high-level language that we're used to, especially in academia, but rather being easily understood by your audiences is really, really important. Social media is not as important as you think. It really isn't. It's only important because people think it's important, which is a funny, weird mental trap. But it actually isn't reflective of how the majority of people think. And what happens online is a very skewed discourse, which we don't tend to recognize. So it can be a very valuable tool for communicating messages, but don't use it as your only tool because you're not going to reach a lot of audiences that you need to again, push for those public narrative changes and push for those public policy changes that you require, again, to change the environment that we exist in. I will always suggest to people that they connect with people in real life, have real conversations with people, canvas if that's something that you have capacity to do. Don't just blurt some statement out online and assume that you've done the work to communicate to the public and the audiences you need to more broadly, because most likely it is not actually reaching them. But yes, you do need both. And there has to be, it's interesting because I was just in Councillor Troster's presentation as well about kind of like how do you bridge the gap between the political world and grassroots advocacy on the ground. And I think that's something that you do pretty well. And it's something that needs to happen where we do work, sometimes in a lot of tension with politicians, but we do work to kind of create the change that's needed again in terms of public policy. So you do need to do both. Some people are really good at one. Other people are really good at the other. I'm a bit better at the inside game, but I do a lot of the outside as well. And the reason why I'm better at the inside game is that my first job, that's me deputing in 2019, I was paid by the City of Toronto to fight the City of Toronto. It's a very weird position to be in. But it gave me a lot of insight as to how to maneuver that in a good way to get what you need without getting fired. So a little bit about what I've been able to do as just some random person working out of their apartment with their 2 cats. I began campaigning across Ontario on Bill 242, which became Bill 6, also known as the Safer Municipalities Act. And this act essentially says that if you are living in an encampment, or any public space, frankly, and you may be suspected of using drugs, no evidence is needed, you can be sent to jail for 6 months, or you can be fined up to $10,000. So in the province of Ontario, we have broadly said that people who have nowhere to go, who are living in encampments because of a dearth of resources, should be criminalized and fined for the predicament that we have put them in, again, through our very poor public policy. Here we are with the first time that we started to hear about this change toward Bill 6. And this came from 15 mayors across the province of Ontario, some of them might be your mayors, who were basically saying that we need the notwithstanding clause to circumvent the human rights of homeless people and evict them from encampments without ever offering shelter or any resources. Cool, sounds like a great solution. But this gained a lot of traction. It's funny but true. There are 444 municipalities in Ontario. This is 15 mayors. That's a drop in the bucket. That's not a lot of people. But it was played up in the media as being this big thing where all of these different municipalities were saying, this is a solution that we need. Forgive my language, that's bullshit. That's not actually what was needed, and it wasn't a lot of people saying it. But because I am a sneaky, sneaky person, I really played up the numbers game here. And Councillor Troster, you were one of the people who I was organizing with, and I said, all right, you got 15 mayors. Across this province, our premier has undermined local democracies. Strong mayor powers, for example, took away power from local councils and placed them directly in the hands of the mayor only. Very undemocratic process. A lot of municipalities have been very angry at the situation in Ontario, which again is taking away power from local democracies. So I said, okay, 15 mayors, how many councillors can I get who will say this is a really bad idea? And I ended up with 84 councillors across the province from all kinds of municipalities, very rural, very urban, who collectively rejected this idea that we need the notwithstanding clause. And you're like, how did you do that? Honestly, I just like cold called people. And there's this council chat of very progressive councillors where I got a couple people that I built trust with to just put it into that chat and to start bringing people into the fold. And so we released a statement, these 80 councillors saying this is a really bad idea. This is not reflective of what the majority of municipalities want in Ontario. And strictly on a numbers game, I could show Doug Ford, well, you got 15 mayors, I got 80 councillors, what are you gonna do about it? Now that said, the bill actually did end up passing, but it was tabled as Bill 6, I think in December, or sorry, Bill 242 in December, but we had a provincial election in between. And what was really funny to me is that to announce this new legislation that he was putting forth, he brought out all these mayors that he had talked to already, these 15 mayors who'd said, this is a really bad idea. And the woman who's circled in yellow, she's not a mayor, she's a councillor from Aurelia. because we won the mayor from Aurelia. And part of what I had done working with these councillors is that we passed motions in 5 municipalities that we will not use a notwithstanding clause to take away people's human rights who are living in encampments. And so Doug Ford had actually noticed what we were doing, and this was his response, was to just kind of be an ass about it and be like, all these mayors are saying this, and then there's just this one random Aurelia councillor who is not a mayor at all. It made me laugh. It means that I got under his skin, and you know what? I'll take that small win. Now, before the bill was passed, we had an election. And what we saw in the election is that encampments became a topic. Not a big topic, but I wanted to make it a topic. And I wanted this to be something that we were broadly talking about during the entirety of the provincial election. So I took a smaller group of councillors and we formed kind of a shell organization called the Ontario Coalition for the Rights of Homeless People. And we just pretended we were like a real organization. Doesn't matter. It gives us some official credibility. You kind of have to be a shit disturber, I'm not going to lie. And so we launched a campaign which was really aimed at bringing on provincial parties into saying we don't want to criminalize encampments. And we sent out thousands and thousands of emails across the province. And I actually managed, we actually managed to get the NDP, the Ontario Green Party, and the Ontario Liberals all to commit to not criminalizing homelessness. Doug Ford didn't. Yay! It didn't make a difference, but I mean, ultimately the bill was passed, but I think we made it a hot topic issue and we got those commitments so that if we have any future changes in government, we may see that the policy will change as well. And we did this with nothing. I think I asked QP Ontario for like $1,000 and I asked ATU Canada for $1,000 and I put it strictly toward buying ad time. That's what I did with that money. And so we still managed, again, to influence those 3 parties into a policy change. Again, I'm a guy who works with a laptop in an apartment. You don't actually need a lot of resources. You just need to think of really funny strategies. It works. I'll skip that for now. Once the election actually happened, and unfortunately we gained another majority from the Premier, Bill 6 was introduced. Again, it was Bill 242, and then because the election happened, everything reset, so it was brought back as Bill 6. And then I was like, okay, I played my card with the councillors. What else can I do? Civil society. We haven't brought civil society into this. And so again, I just started cold calling and cold emailing organizations across Ontario and brought 114 organizations working in Ontario to sign a joint letter, not just decrying the Safer Municipalities Act, Bill 6, but also linking it to policy in the United States that is used by Donald Trump. So in the US, there is policy in a number of states, a number of municipalities, and again, that Trump has leveraged that says, oh, you're living outside in an encampment? Okay, 6 months of jail time and a $5,000 fine. In Ontario, it's a $10,000 fine, but it's the exact same policy. So we wanted to make him look like a jerk by tying him to Donald Trump. And that actually kind of struck a chord with people. That was the new strategy. And I actually cold called the National Homelessness Center in Washington, D.C., and I was like, would you write me a letter to Doug Ford? And they're like, sure. And they published this letter. It got picked up by the media. And suddenly we had a comparison between Doug Ford and Donald Trump as being the same guy on homelessness policy. Ultimately, we didn't win. Oops, I'll go back. But we had rallies across the province. These 114 organizations that got involved, we were able to actually have rallies in Toronto, in Kingston, in Ottawa, and Port Hope. And again, what I wanted to show was that homelessness is not a partisan issue. And even though I worked for the NDP in the past, I don't really care about political parties. I care about the issues and the outcomes. So again, because I had done that work during the election to bring in the Liberals, the Greens, and the NDP, I was like, do you want to come speak at this rally? Can you get along enough to all speak at the rally together? And I forced their arm on this. I was like, if you want to be involved and take credit, then you got to do that. And they were reluctant, but we got all 3 parties to speak at our rally. And again, show that this is an unpopular issue, not a partisan issue, but just broadly politically unpopular with politicians, with civil society, and with people actually doing the work. So that's what I got to say about that. But just to say, be really wily. Be wily. Think of like what kind of jerk things that you can do to get under people's skin. And trust me, I've done a lot of this. It can sometimes work pretty well. So thanks.
Thank you so much. That was great. And you'll see the through line throughout these presentations focused on building collective power, how you build coalitions, and understanding community-driven and grassroots campaigns. I'm excited for the next set of presentations. Just give me a moment to pull it up. And if you're at the back and you want a seat, there are a couple seats scattered. You're welcome to stay there, but just wanted to let you know that there are seats available at the front here. This is right? Yeah. Okay, perfect. All right, thank you.
Great. Well, that's a hard presentation to follow. I'm Yutaka Dirks. I work for an organization called the Canadian Centre for Housing Rights, which works on housing rights across Canada. I don't live in Ontario. I used to live in Ontario, but I live in Manitoba. And the work I'm presenting today, I think, builds on some of what Diana was talking about, like those nuts and bolts and strategies of policy change that she was talking about. But I'm really looking at how do we who work in community-based organizations, especially those that directly serve communities who are facing the housing crisis, how do we engage in policy advocacy given the context of being a worker in that situation? And then also how do we ensure that we actually involve or support the self-directed advocacy of people who are facing the crisis or are hit hardest by the crisis? And so this is based on a research project. There's a few copies at the back, and if you're interested, I can send you a link for the more. I'm really hoping that the research gets used to make the argument to the organizations that you work in to devote resources to this kind of work and to maybe change policies and change things internally to support the kind of work that Diana was talking about. So yes, I just wanted to, I think I have to thank the Social Sciences Humanities Research Council for funding it through the Manitoba Research Alliance, but I'm going to get started. So, you know, homelessness and housing insecurity, as Diana was talking about, is a systemic issue. It's not the result of personal choices or failings, we know that. It's the result of policy decisions by government, and ultimately, in my opinion, it's the natural outcome of an economic system in which basic needs such as housing are commodified. And so that means a solution requires policy change, but it also requires actually like fundamental societal change. And in my opinion, that kind of fundamental societal change only comes up through the self-activity of people who are affected by the issue, pushing governments to change things in really substantial ways. And so I'm interested and have been throughout my life organizing and working in nonprofits and both within and outside of them on, you know, how can we ensure that people who are directly affected by the issue are able to like be part of that advocacy and lead that advocacy. So that's really where the impetus for this research project came about. And so we looked at how community-based organizations engage in policy advocacy, and we defined policy advocacy as I've got it listed up there, sort of intentional policies or actions. And then we also buy institutions or governments, and so we considered not just governments, but institutions like landlords, and then the activity of people trying to make changes in that kind of policy action. So we looked at the kind of community-based organizations, or we looked at community-based organizations in Winnipeg. So, you know, having lived in Toronto for many years, born there, now living in Winnipeg, cities outside of Toronto are very different than Toronto in terms of the kind of resources that they have, in terms of the political environment. And so hopefully those of you who maybe live in smaller centers can find something in this research to help you, because really I think the housing crisis, having lived in cities across Canada and traveled widely, the fundamental questions or problems are still the same, but really like the particularities are different, and I think that does shape how we should be organizing the kind of work that happens, even the kind of possibilities that exist in our communities across the country. So we looked at, sort of based on the literature and based on our experience, so I did this work with Dr. Sarah Cooper at the University of Manitoba. So based on our experience and on the literature that exists, we sort of came up with a few different categories of the kind of policy advocacy that people can engage in. Raising awareness with government directly or through other means, joining advocacy coalitions, raising awareness with the public, participating in formal processes like government consultations. Oftentimes government want to hear from people about the issues of the day, engaging in research or policy development, supporting grassroots activism, so supporting the self-organization of, say, tenants or people who are homeless or inadequately housed, and then engaging in confrontation with government, so that might be protesting or sort of more confrontational activities vis-a-vis government, and then also engaging in legal challenges or processes, like maybe launching a legal challenge, like we did with the Tanujaja case, the right to housing case, back in 2010, 2012. So I sort of ranked them based on our survey data, because we surveyed staff who worked at community-based organizations in Winnipeg, and then also did a round of interviews with staff in terms of what they most likely engaged in, or what they most often engaged in. So you see that community-based organizations played this inside game, a lot of them. They developed relationships with government or with city staff or municipal or provincial staff, and that's where they felt that they had the most influence sometimes and where they felt the most comfortable. They also were able to join advocacy coalitions because it sort of put some of that pressure, as you said, off of them, because the advocacy coalition could take the stand that the community organization on its own felt like they couldn't do. So they could say, oh, we'll sign on to that letter. We won't, go out in the media and say those exact things, but we will join on to that coalition and have the coalition say those things. So that was a way for community-based organizations to take stronger stands that they were a little bit nervous about taking. That I think was one of the strategies that they used. Now, we also looked at the kind of community-based, or the kind of policy advocacy that community-based organizations took part in, where they involved community members or their clients or people who were not staff at the community-based organization. And so you can see that there are some differences here. Suddenly research and policy development is moved to the top. It's a thing that they were most likely to involve their clients or community members in, which makes sense because there is a lot of research loves to hear from poor, marginalized, oppressed people, and oftentimes researchers will contact community organizations to connect them with people who are facing these issues. So of course that raises some interesting questions about the agency of people who are being asked about their lives and how hard they are, but there is certainly a role for that kind of research to play in creating the arguments and building the case for the changes that we're seeking. There was also raising awareness with the public and raising awareness with government were some of the top things. One of the things that they noted in the interviews was that direct participation with government, it fell down because they recognized that those relationships they had or those formal processes that they had with government were alienating or not actually comfortable spaces for the clients that they worked with or the people, the tenants that they helped. And so they did try to sort of, consult with their clients, consult with community members and bring their voices forward. And they thought about that in ways of like being accountable to the community and ensuring that they're actually raising the issues that matter to the communities that they serve. But there was this recognition that these are alienating processes. These are not spaces that are comfortable to our clients. And so that's sort of how they felt about those processes. We also asked what impacts, what kind of factors impacted their ability or the likelihood of engaging in political advocacy. Factors that most decreased advocacy, which I think will not be a surprise to anyone who works in a community-based organization on the front line, is lack of staff time, that service delivery takes the priority, and that there are insufficient resources. Like the people really felt like, especially since the pandemic, that they were always putting out fires and there just wasn't that time and that space to devote to advocacy, even if they were even if the organization sort of allowed them to do it on the side of their desks, there was just so much pressure to do the casework immediately that they couldn't engage in the kind of advocacy that some of them wanted to. You know, interestingly, the lack of support from the executive director didn't really seem to be much of a problem. So, I think some of that might be a factor of, well, the people that wanted to talk to us were the people who were interested in doing the advocacy. So there is a bit of that aspect of this research. And I think one of the things that's interesting, we talked about the advocacy chill. They did talk about funding rules limiting advocacy. But I think when they talked about it in our interviews, they said, we are supposed to deliver these services, but they did find ways to do the advocacy, and I think that accounts maybe for their strategy of doing the direct advocacy directly to the government, because that sort of allowed them to push, but in a way that it wasn't a public push, or it was a safer way to do it if they met face-to-face with the government they were trying to push for policy change with, as opposed to joining a demonstration or putting out an op-ed that was really critical of the government. So there are strategies that community-based organizations, at least in Winnipeg, are using and have used to do the advocacy, and they're using creative ways and finding creative ways to sort of do what they can. Sort of one thing that I should add on that last piece is that we asked also, do they have a formal policy around advocacy? And some organizations had done things like consulted and built policies about how they engage in advocacy, or they built policies, for example, on decolonization, and built policies in relationship or response to the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women report and things like that. So they had this commitment from the organization that we care about this issue, that this issue matters to us. And so when advocacy or policy issues came up that were related to commitments that they had made as an organization, staff found it easier to take on or to make the argument to their EDs that we should be doing something about this because the organization had already committed to decolonization, for example, or they committed to queer rights or something like that, and maybe there was an issue that came up that related to that. That gave an in for staff who wanted to do the advocacy to make that argument that this is something that the organization should be doing. So, this is some, just looking, I'll go through this quickly, external sort of impacts to advocacy on the part of CBOs. Interestingly, like most of the things didn't matter to them. I think that sort of points to like if someone has the fire, someone wants to do the work, they will do it. And organizations, despite a hostile general public or things like that, they will engage in that advocacy, which is encouraging to see. So one of the things we also wanted to know is how people were involved in the advocacy linked to community-based organizations. So we broke out sort of the kind of ways that community-based organizations often engage with their clients or engage with community members who aren't staff in policy advocacy. This sort of relates to, I'm sure some of you have seen, like Arnstein's ladder of participation in terms of how we involve the community in issues that affect them. And so there's a whole range from, consultation, really tokenized ways of involving people up to having them directly to direct or lead the advocacy projects. And we see that in Winnipeg, organizations are doing it at all different levels. So they were, unfortunately though, they were often more likely to be attendees at an advocacy activity as opposed to, sort of leading it independently. We also asked the staff who work at these community-based organizations, what do they think would limit the participation of people who are facing the housing crisis directly from getting involved in organizing, getting involved in advocacy. A huge one was obviously these daily survival issues, lack of practical support. So like when you're facing eviction, when you're dealing with health issues, lack of incredibly low social assistance rates, things like that, those things do take priority, and you can see why someone might not want to get involved. But other people in our interviews also noted sort of this disconnect between sort of the long game that we're talking about with policy advocacy and that daily survival issue. Like, we want to see immediate changes in people's lives now. They certainly need it. And so because they can't see that through the advocacy, a lot of people thought that that was one of the reasons that held people back. Though I think one of the things that was interesting that came out in the interviews is that some people sort of saw that and said, okay, like, we can't do anything about it. And then there were other people that we interviewed who thought, like, well, how do we connect the issue that I see every day that the clients come in with to an advocacy? Like, how do I make that small, like, problem an advocacy thing that we can win, like a small win? And so there's an organization that developed sort of like a list of policy fails, like not large-scale, sort of massive policy changes, but small things that had a real impact on a daily basis with their clients. And so they were able to move some of those forwards and get some of those wins because they weren't asking for new policy programs, they weren't asking for new legislation, they were asking for a change in something, a change in how policy is sort of implemented at the internal level from a ministry or whatever, and they were able to move those things forward, which made a real difference in people's lives. And so I think that's another way that community-based organizations can think through how do we connect the sort of daily struggles that people face that we're working with people on to advocacy and create some of those small wins, which then build that energy and that ability for us to take on the larger, longer campaigns. So all of this, I think, raises the question of, are we talking about whether CBOs should increase the participation by those directly affected by the housing crisis in their policy advocacy, to move them up Arnstein's ladder of participation, or to support community-led efforts to build their own power? And I think, like, as someone who's done both, someone who continues to do both, I think it's not an either-or question, but I think certainly those of us who work in community-based organizations can do a lot better in terms of ensuring that the work that we do accurately reflects the needs, the demands of people who are facing the housing crisis, and that we do what we can to support them. And so these are some of the quotes. I'm not going to go through them. I want to sort of get to the end and make sure that Art has a lot of time for his presentation. But these are some of the ways that the interview subjects that I talk to, the people who are working in the community-based organizations, we're trying to think through this question. How do we remain accountable to the communities that we serve? How do we support them not only to sort of raise their voices up, but to actually, like, work collectively, build collective power on their own? And how do we, who have more resources than the people that we work with, how do we ensure that we do it in a good way, and then we do it in a way that sort of helps build that collective power of people who are facing the housing crisis? So as a result of the ideas that people brought up and looking at the literature and things like that, we came up with some ideas of what community-based organizations can do. And it's in the report, and I would encourage you, if you are in a community-based organization, and interested in trying to make this argument with your ED or with your board, I hope that it will be useful. It's obviously it's a small sample of community-based organizations that we surveyed, but hopefully the fact that it's a research report and not just a workshop or a talk, it like sort of lends some support to your work in your organization to ensure that we can do this kind of advocacy. So, as I mentioned before, developing a policy around advocacy and developing a policy around issues, right? So that when things come up suddenly, we're not sort of scrambling and our leadership is worried about what do we think about this? How should we respond to this? Like, all these issues are long-standing, and we should have ideas of, like, we know what we think about this, and we know what the solutions are, and this is what we are calling for, and this is what we should push for. One of the things that is also raised is, like, developing a solidarity policy. So this is something that came up with some research that staff from Parkdale Community Legal Services in Ontario, Cole Weber and Martine August did around how legal clinics and community-based organizations can support self-directed tenant organizing. Develop a solidarity policy in your organization so that, sometimes, the community, the people in encampments, the community-based organizations will take stands which we might be uncomfortable with. That they might go on a rent strike, and as maybe legal clinic staff, we might get a little nervous about like saying, "Oh yeah, you should withhold your rent," because of course there's the possibility you could get evicted. But finding ways from before that moment happens to say like, we're not going to criticize the self-activity of people who are facing the housing crisis. We're going to find a way to stand in solidarity with them so that they aren't left out to dry, right? Like, doing what we can in advance. So when that crisis happens and the ED and the leadership of your community-based organization is getting these frantic calls from the board, you have something to lean on, saying we've already thought this through. We've already made a position on how we can support those people who are hard hit. And then, obviously ensuring that policy advocacy is a whole organization responsibility, that it doesn't fall on the activist who happens to be hired, who's doing it off the side of their desk. And then also, developing peer support networks within organizations or across organizations so that those people who are doing the work, don't feel isolated, so they can learn from each other, so that they can, work against that burnout. Because I think I agree, like the thing that, the sort of strongest antidote to burnout is like working with other people and we're struggling together, right? Like we are more likely to burn out if we're the only person doing it and if we feel like we're the only person doing it. And then finding ways to integrate casework and direct advocacy. And so that might be just developing like that list of policy fails, or it may be looking at like, oh, we're getting all these calls and they're, about an above guideline rent increase, or about an issue that's actually a building-wide issue, for example. So like right there's an issue that's facing not just that one person in the building, but the entire building. And so finding ways to sort of see where individual issues are systemic issues that you can then plug into community-based organizations or tenant unions or things like that. And then, of course, there are internal things that community-based organizations can do. We can do training. We can seek funding, because some of the organizations were able to find funding, like to find someone to do outreach or community outreach, and then you can get the money to do community outreach, and then that ends up being community organizing. So there are ways to make that happen. And then, of course, one of the ways that we can be more accountable is ensuring that we recruit, that we train, and we retain people who actually have direct experience of the housing crisis, whether that's in our board or whether that's in our staff. And then, importantly, one of the issues that was raised in my research, and certainly I'm sure it's applicable in many other contexts, is ensuring that the organizations develop relationships with elders in the community who are able to sort of provide that support to people, community members who want to engage in that advocacy, who can sort of provide that long, the emotional support, the cultural support to ensure that the advocacy is really sustained at a personal and community level. So, thank you very much. If you are interested in the report, I can definitely send you an email, but I'm going to pass it off to Art. Thanks.
All right. I feel like the role of the moderator is a bit void when we say pass it on, and then I come here and I pass it on further. But it's this one, right?
I'm not entirely sure.
Okay, let's do this one. Let's go to the beginning. Sorry. That looks right. Okay.
Thanks. So hi, my name is Art Campbell, and I head up an organization called the Collectif Québécois pour la prévention de l'itinérance. In English, it is the Quebec Homelessness Prevention Collaborative. So what we're going to be looking at today is something of a case study of a current project that we have on the go that we started last year, early last year. And it's called Co-Constructing a Legal Framework to Prevent Homelessness in Quebec. The short name will just Legal Framework. So what we're going to be looking at specifically is how we built that process, the methodology we used, and also some of the variables that we took into consideration when we were recruiting and recruiting our coalition and also maintaining it. So that's today's menu. So I'd say the bulk of the points will be on spending our time on point 4 and 5, but we'll look at the objectives of the session, give you a quick primer introduction into the Quebec Homelessness Prevention Collaborative, a spotlight on the legal framework project, just so you understand what it is that we're trying to achieve and perhaps motivate you to take on a project of that nature yourselves. And then the methodology that we followed, or we are following because it's ongoing, and some considerations to sustain a coalition. So I don't usually read slides verbatim, but this is our new mission, so we're kind of proud of it. It was just adopted. And so, faced with major societal challenges of homelessness, which is often addressed solely from the perspective of emergency response and rehousing, the collaborative aims to promote a complementary approach focused on prevention. To this end, we bring together folks from academia, community, the public sector, and also people with lived experience to develop public policy, to develop and advocate for public policy and legal reform recommendations. We mobilize this knowledge also we share and mobilize it through webinars and conferences. And we support the provincial government in this transition and assisting in the implementations of solutions. I'd say the third one is somewhat aspirational, but we're a very collaborative organization, and essentially we'll work with anybody who wants to work with us. This is not working. Okay, so where we focus, I don't know, are you familiar, have you ever seen this topology before? It was developed by a woman named Susan Fitzpatrick and Peter Mackey and some other very fine researchers out of Wales. So this is a topology that we adopted because we find it very pragmatic, very accessible. It's temporal nature also. So essentially there's 5 forms of prevention, according to Fitzpatrick. And as you go down, look at it as sort of as a snake. I'm going to add numbers to make it clearer to follow the path. But as you move down the snake, the time you have to react becomes less and less. So universal prevention, a bit as it would say, speaks to interventions that are good for the entire population, increasing social housing, things of that nature. Targeted prevention is focusing on high-risk populations. As an example, individuals leaving institutions such as prisons, child protection, hospitals. Crisis prevention is imminent homelessness, likely to occur in the near future, evictions being an example. And emergency prevention is support for people at immediate risk of homelessness, people who are showed up at the door of a shelter. And repeat prevention is to support those, for example, that have been rehoused and providing adequate support so that they do not fall back into homelessness. The color coding has nothing to do with importance. It is more just to indicate where we're putting our focus. So we're putting our focus on the first 3, perhaps a little bit less on universal. But I mean, for all intent and purpose, they could all be green, those first 3. And the last 2, for the simple reason that there's plenty of advocacy, plenty of expertise, and plenty of work that's already happening in those areas, we've decided to be working a little further upstream. So very quickly, we are a team of 2 salaried employees, so you have 50% of the staff in front of you, but we do have over 100 committed professionals involved, coming from those areas that I mentioned earlier on, working in 6 working groups, looking at high-risk populations, 1 cross-cutting group on prevention evictions. We've put out 4 reports to date, 3 new ones planned for 25-26. We came about in 21, so we're a fairly young organization. I already spoke to how we mobilize some of our knowledge, and we have 2 provincial projects on the go. One is to define homelessness prevention in collaboration with an organization called the RECIC. And the last one, the project that we're going to be looking at right now, which is to co-construct a legal framework to prevent homelessness. Okay, so despite decades of effort to reduce homelessness in Quebec, the number of individuals experience homelessness, be they visible, be they hidden, be they at risk, is just increasing. We can no longer clearly speak of homelessness in Quebec as a homelessness crisis or a housing crisis. It's clearly a structural phenomenon that needs to be looked at through that lens and addressed in all its complexity. The cases, or the causes, I should say, are multiple and deep-rooted. They include speculation, lack of tenant rights, increasing evictions, particularly no-fault evictions, and also there's an ever-increasing impact from unplanned discharges from provincial institutions. They are amongst the unintentional, obviously, but the biggest suppliers of vulnerable people that become homeless in our province. So clearly the situation requires us to completely rethink how we're going about this, looking at, be it our structures, our systems, and particularly in the case of the Legal Framework Project, our laws. So this is a new deck. I apologize. I'm always very impressed when I see people just going through a presentation without notes. But anyway, so we drew inspiration from several European countries, and we also initiated our own initiatives. And the first one was we published a report in 2022 on legal reform to protect women victims of conjugal violence. In 2023, we submitted a briefing note, I'd say almost a business case, to the Quebec Minister of Social Services, proposing a law to prevent homelessness. In both cases, I'd say the reception was polite, a bit of mediatic coverage for the first one, but really no uptake. So it became clear to us that unless we got to a point where we could institutionalize homelessness prevention, and it was unlikely it would happen. And secondly, we couldn't do this on our own. We needed to form a coalition and work together to co-create something, and also its advocacy. So the approach, the objective of this project, of the Legal Framework Project, is to make homelessness prevention a a provincial priority through two means. One is co-creating a rights-based legal framework, and secondly, establishing a collective movement to ensure its adoption. The three guiding principles is gradual implementation of the right to housing, the instauration of mechanisms to responsibilize the state, and the introduction of enforceable legal remedies for individuals when the state doesn't do what it's meant to do. And we broke this down into 4 priority areas. One was strengthening the right to housing within the Quebec Charter, to make it explicit, is to prevent evictions through the law, better planning and outcomes of institutional discharges, and the preservation and development of social housing. So this is the methodology and the timeline of this ongoing project. So it actually started in May, and it finishes, quote unquote, in November 26, and I will put that into context. And the November 2025 is just to indicate where we are more or less today. So the conceptualization and the recruitment. So conceptualization is getting a 2-pager that was intelligent enough to be able to go out and recruit, a dozen organizations, provincial organizations, and some researchers and some jurists. And we actually kicked off the project in September, about a year ago, last year. So I'd say, and through that period, through September to January, it was a lot about getting acquainted. Because we had roughly 15 people that didn't necessarily know each other, coming from housing, rights defense, and obviously homelessness organizations, but also jurists and researchers from a number of universities working in a really, really diversified group of individuals. And so we sort of lay the groundwork, got clear on the governance, and we started to determine what our scope was. And these are things that I showed in the previous slide. So that's one aspect of our scope. And come February, we came to the realization that we needed to create subcommittees, because up until then, we've been working in one large committee. And I neglected to mention Indigenous folks also are part of this project, very much so. So we created subcommittees that, again, in the previous slide, that started working on those 4 aspects of the project, applying the right to housing and thinking about always how we could responsibilize the state and also the role that legal remedies could play for individuals. So we sort of did a State of the Union between February of this year to about now, and we started identifying our preliminary measures. And we integrated additional First Nation representatives into the project also during that time period. So right now we're at the point where we're prioritizing those measures, we're transposing them into legal terms, which we expect will take about 2 months. We are planning to do a cost-benefit analysis, and the report writing is going to be starting shortly and will be going on to the end of March. So where we expect to have a full and a conceptual report drafted. And the reason that when I speak to a conceptual report, I will explain. I'd say another piece is the strategy. So from an advocacy standpoint, and based on what I heard from Diana, I think we might need to hire you. We need to start working on our strategy, I'd say, come November or probably December, is essentially how are we going to take this concept, this legal reform, conceptualize it so it's digestible, and socialize those concepts throughout the province and build social and political adhesion and momentum. Because at the end of November, or the beginning of November of 2026, we have a provincial election. So the timing of getting this done by March is really, really key for 3 reasons. 1, for this project itself. 2, we've also been working on defining homelessness prevention, that we will be rolling out that definition. It's within an enormous coalition at the same time frame. And also, the data from the last homelessness count in Quebec will be coming out at about that time. So like the perfect storm. And we believe it's going to, draw an enormous amount of attention on the subject. So then we have April through November to sign up all political parties in Quebec and civil society that we need a legal reform to prevent homelessness. So that's the project. So these are some considerations to sustain, these are some considerations to take into consideration. Oh boy, these are some elements to consider to sustain. That's definitely a change in the presentation, to sustain a coalition. So, if I was to ask you, top of mind, what are some things that you can think of that you need to take into account when you're recruiting, building a coalition, and maintaining it, sustaining it? Any ideas? Question? Yes.
In my experience, just capacity, because so often the people who are willing to jump in and get involved are also juggling many other projects, and that has certainly been my experience. So it's the people doing the work who are doing the work, right? So if you're able to bring in people who are not, or maybe new to the work, and build capacity that way, I think that's important.
Okay, thank you. Any other thoughts? And actually, one of the points that I'll be bringing up really speaks to what you just said. And Maggie, picture. Yeah. So.
Is that on the screen?
No, it's not on the screen.
It's
no.
transcribed.
Okay. So, no, it's not on the screen. I don't know. So, one of the first things is shared purpose. And when I spoke to, we took a few months, maybe 5 months to get clear on our governance, on our decision-making mechanism, on our scope. But it was all, we did this, we proposed some things, but essentially we did this together. So it was coming up with shared purpose and a framing that unites that incredibly diverse coalition, and that people could see that there's mutual benefit to being part of this organization, because as we all know, being part of a coalition is 100% voluntary. And so, it needs to speak to the folks involved. I think perhaps I've already spoken to that, but diverse representation. We really went out of our way to approach organizations that perhaps you wouldn't necessarily think would be involved in a project preventing homelessness. And as a matter of fact, probably the least number of people in the project are from the homelessness sector. There are some folks, but since we're looking further upstream, we went very, very wide. And this speaks to your point. Yes, often the people that raise their hands say, yeah, I'll come in. They are typically, very, very busy folks. So important that there's there's somebody in charge of coordination. In this case, it's ourselves, it's our organization. But there's a clear decision-making process. The roles are well-defined. So that cannot be understated. I think between shared purpose, inclusive membership, all of these, it's a given. But that there's, when we speak to transparency, is that when we see, for whatever the reason, that we're not hitting our targets in terms of what we expected, we would be delivering at such and such a time. And by that way, the methodology that I showed you, we initially came up with an entirely different methodology, and we quickly realized that it wouldn't work. And so it was that we were kind of building the plane and flying it too, and we're still kind of doing that because there's no sort of guidebook as to how to go about this. So strategic alignment is obviously very, very key. We're very much an evidence-based organization. It's where all of our entities, typically we have somebody from academia, somebody from community co-chairing them. So practice meets evidence, evidence meets practice. So we use sort of the low-hanging fruit that comes from evidence to decide, and that also helped us choose the scope that I shared with you earlier on. Core funding, mainly for coordination, which we have. The last thing you need for a project of this size and complexity is to be looking for funding at the same time. I can say that we're looking for funding for advocacy, but I'm very confident that we will find it. Capacity building, learning, accountability, regular evaluation. Every meeting has very, very clear objectives. The agenda supports the objectives. We validate at the end of the meeting, did we meet our objectives? And we're constantly asking ourselves, sort of internal evaluation, are we on the right track? And I'd say, generally speaking, as our partners are showing up pretty much every meeting, of which there's one every 3 weeks for various individuals, which translates for us one every one or two every week, and everybody's showing up. I think we're on the right track. Political and social context, and this also was part of our reflection when we chose our scope, and seizing policy and political windows. In this case, as I mentioned earlier, the fact that we have an election coming up in November, that the data from the homelessness count is going to be coming out about the same time that we put out our findings. This is not by par hasard. This is not by chance. I mean, my name is Art Campbell, so you don't get more English than that, but I speak French all the time, so to find myself looking for English words is kind of funny. So those are some of the things that that we consider and focus on, and then this is kind of a checklist to say, well, is your coalition healthy? And and this is not scientific, but these are 5 indicators, that we identified, and I'd say they're all important, but I highlighted in yellow some of the elements that we're finding are particularly important to look at to determine whether or not our coalition is healthy. Just to give time for questions, I don't think I'll go further than that. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you to our presenters. That was awesome. I want to make sure we leave time for questions. I was saying to the presenters as well that I think there's a bit of feedback that this session wraps around 5:15. But if there's more questions, we want to stick around. Some of the presenters can stay afterwards because we're at the end of the day. So we want to make sure we use the mic for interpreters. So if you have a question, you can put your hand up, and I'll come around to you. Not all at once. Okay, perfect. That'll get the ball rolling. Thank you.
I guess, so I'm from New Brunswick, northern New Brunswick. We kind of have a bit of a nonprofit void. Sorry. It's time to take my medication. So I guess, and we have a community action board, through Reaching Home, structure for funding and so on and so forth, but we have very few nonprofit actors around the table. We're all essentially government employees from different branches, and we don't necessarily have the ability to advocate, because it might, like even in our job descriptions, we're not allowed to kind of advocate against our own, right? So it's kind of so if you maybe have some tips around how to advocate when you're in that precarious situation, and maybe not have the avenues, in our communities to promote for advocacy.
In the mic.
Why are you pointing at me for? I might not have a great answer for this. I have worked inside the government. Obviously, you're limited in what you can say and do, especially in the context of a political party, which is where I was working. Have worked at the City of Toronto and have worked with city staff who I know are very sympathetic to some of the issues that I've been bringing up as an advocate, but cannot publicly, or sometimes in some cases with our former mayor, even talk about it internally with other colleagues. I've always made myself available for that space where even now I'm looking for people inside certain ministries to build connections with. But I exist, right? I'm somebody on the outside that reasonably people can come and have a conversation with about how, through back channels we might be able to work together. There's gotta be someone around, maybe not exactly like me, or an organization even very, very grassroots who might be willing to kind of build those connections. But it does require a high level of trust for obvious reasons, because you don't want to be outed and lose your job. And from the other side, there can also be pushback against working with government employees. So it's a long process of trying to find those connections in the community to where trust can be built. But I think they do exist. I've also worked in Peel region. I'm going to go start a new network in York region, which is just above Toronto. And these are places where traditionally there hasn't been a lot of advocacy, but we've built it from the ground up by finding those community connects. So they're there. It just requires, I think, some looking for them. And also within your colleagues, your coworkers, what can you do together? Can you create some kind of umbrella where you're not named specifically? It's an anonymous organization. I think there are ways to get around it, but that also comes with its own risks. So not the greatest answer, and I'm getting so much feedback, so sorry. I'll move my head over here if others want to broach that question.
Actually, I do have something to add. In our work, we do have public sector employees that participate in our working groups, and in some cases, the way they've been able to advocate within their ministry is that they're allowed to participate and voice all their concerns and be quite transparent because they realize they're as much part of the problem as they could be the solution. But we don't name them in the final report. So we do speak to justice issues, but we don't name that we had participants from the Ministry of Justice. So obviously that implies that there's a community organization that is going to provide those constructs to have those exchanges. But that is one way that we've that we've been able to get participation from government, from bureaucrats. Just that there's anonymity in the final equation, that they're not part of, they're not mentioned.
Yeah, and just from my perspective, like, it's been really helpful when I've met with people who are government staff who are supportive, and, like, you know, as someone who's outside, to sometimes intelligence flows from them to us that we don't say where it came from, but it can be helpful to guide the strategies that we use to influence government. But also, like, having people who are supportive or understand the systemic problems and how to address them makes it great when they're sort of tasked with, by, like, councillors, for example, using the municipal example, to create a policy about something, like writing the best possible policy or producing the best possible staff report that they can. And that's the case what we have in Winnipeg. Is actually, we don't have someone like Ariel on council, but we have really good people in the housing staff. And so actually our bottleneck is finding the staff or the councillors to support the staff thing that is actually more progressive than the councillors are willing to be. So, you know, like, there's a different thing there. But in terms of New Brunswick, I know that there's, like, the New Brunswick Coalition for Tenants' Rights, I think. So there are some organizations. I know that Tobin LeBlanc Haley from UNB is involved in that, and so I know there are some, maybe not in the community that you live in, but there are some organizations in New Brunswick that are working on some of these issues. So I think, yeah, just trying to find them and seeing how to get involved, or in what capacity you can do that.
Great responses from everyone. Thank you so much. Do we have another question from the audience? One thing that stuck out to me, Art, was in your presentation, you talked about the value of bringing people from other sectors into this. And I know, Diana, this is something that you've done, and I'm curious of what that looks like in the research that you've done as well. But maybe highlighting kind of the value of bringing, you know, our sector has only so much capacity, especially people are working frontline. Like, how can we bring other people into the coalitions that work in other sectors where we might not even think there's an intersection, but there's actually a lot of space for them to do stuff that's meaningful in the advocacy work. So maybe just speaking to that, I think, would be really helpful for many of you.
Who wants to go first?
I could go. Because it's, I'd say the subject at hand kind of, it lends itself to that in as much that prevention, you don't, when it's homelessness prevention, it's not explicitly, it's not explicit that you need only homelessness actors, because when you're working upstream, there's a lot of other expertises that, you know, urban governance, social work, social housing support groups, and so on and so forth. And also the fact that we knew pretty much from the start that there would be a rights dimension to the legal form that we sought to co-develop. Well, it was very key that we needed to have that. We needed also to have that expertise. And then from a researcher standpoint, we went sort of two-pronged in as much that we looked for a lot of diverse expertises, economists, law, social work, urban governance, but also we went wide in terms of the universities that we were looking to attract to the table, so it would not come across as a Montreal-centric initiative, but from across the province, so that also the regional nuances that one needs to take into consideration, just the same as Indigenous nuances, be it city issues or be it community issues for the Indigenous folks. So that's why obviously the broader you go, the more complex it is, but the richer and more credible the potential solution.
In my experience, people are hungry to get involved, and that is not just within our sector, it's very, very broadly. And I'm often thinking when I'm strategizing around certain things, who is the right voice or the most powerful voice to influence change in this particular context? It's something I think about a lot, and I'm often looking for kind of non-traditional voices to be involved to actually achieve particular advocacy outcomes. And so, for instance, in the city of Toronto, last year I helped win $143 million from the federal government for refugee shelter. This year, they're like, we don't need to do that anymore, which is to say we are facing a mass exodus of refugees from the shelter system who will be out on the street. This government, Carney government, does not want to listen to me. They do not care about civil society. I know that. They're looking for voices that are more aligned with the business sector. Okay, I'll play ball. So I've gotten the Toronto Board of Trade to write to the federal government, and I'm trying now to make connections to banks. It's my nightmare. It's not, maybe not my nightmare, but kind of my nightmare. People that normally I would not engage in these kinds of issues, but that I know can have influence and are not necessarily on the other side of the issues. I had at one point, actually it was Tim Richter, who was like, would you speak to this bank? They're interested in supporting people who sleep in the vestibules with their ATM machines. I was like, that's very interesting. So I'm trying to build a connection there to influence the federal government to not pull that refugee funding. I'm also looking at universities because what I've learned is that York University, which is in the north end of Toronto, there is a mass exodus of people from downtown every day who go and sleep on the campus at night, to the point where they've actually hired someone to coordinate support for those folks. They're thinking about this, right? They're thinking about the fact that there are people homeless every night on their campus, and the majority of them are refugees. So if we expel people from the system, where are they going to go? They're going to go to that campus and other campuses. So you have to kind of look at the broad environment and see not just where the impacts are on our sector, but where you might see repercussions in places you normally wouldn't be thinking about at all, like a university campus or the vestibule of a bank. So I'm always thinking about how do you get them involved? And interestingly, more often than not, they're really excited to actually do that kind of work. People like being asked to be involved and be part of something. So I've found more often than not, if you just ask, you invite people, I'd say 90% of the time that I've done that, even just through cold calling, people have been really responsive to that. So I don't know why I'm looking at you. It's because you're looking at me. That is not where the question came from. That's not where the question came from. But I just want to put that out there. Like, when I say be wily, be really wily. Be creative about it. I have a BFA. I used to be an artist, so I'm always just like, what can we do that is just like outside of what traditionally we would think. So just to put that out there, that people are more often than not very willing to get involved who you would not expect.
Yeah, and just to go off of that, I think like that shows sort of when you can find like unlikely allies because they have some interest that's shared but maybe not apparent to them, or maybe not apparent, like obviously at the first glance an obvious interest that they have in the same outcome. But I think like one of the things we also have to recognize, is that in some cases there are people who just will not be your allies because their interests are the opposite of the interests of the community that you're working with. So I, as a tenant organizer and as someone who works around tenants' rights, there are many ways that campaigns that we can run that both landlords and tenants will support. But there are some things like rent regulation, for example, that like uniformly landlords and landlord lobby organizations push against and push hard against. And so sort of recognizing those places where you can find the unlucky allies and where you can have an overlapping interest, and also those moments in your advocacy work where you're just like, no, actually this is something that matters so much to the community that we're working with that we can't bring someone on the table who will end up like pushing back against one of our core demands like rent regulation or tenant protection. So like even in the coalition that I work in, Right to Housing Coalition in Manitoba, which has some property management companies who support the coalition. They support the public funding of social housing because they manage social housing properties. Whenever we put out press releases or do more work around rent regulation, we do get some like angry emails from some of our members saying like, what are you talking about? Like, that's going to bankrupt us. And so there has to be some education work internally around those sorts of things, but there has to also, like, it certainly has not caused us to back down from that, because that is one of the major causes of the lack of affordability. It's one of the major causes of the lack of security of tenure in Manitoba is the ability for landlords to increase the rent above the guidelines. So, it's not a campaign demand that we're going to take away. It's something that we're going to push forward regardless of what some members of our organization think, because it matters the most to the people who are affected by the issue.
That's a great note to end on. And we're at time as well. So let's give another round of applause to our presenters. Thank you so much. And if you want to ask questions, they're here for a little bit. But otherwise, you're free to go. And thanks so much. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow.
Thank you.